chapter 15, I'm coming back to an idea that there was just not time to unpack last time that is suggested to me in verse 5. Then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, "The Gentiles must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses." This, pardon me, is a thumbnail sketch of the fundamental beliefs and convictions of the Pharisees. It had everything to do with law keeping. And the thing I didn't have time to talk about as much as I want to talk about it was the idea of legalism. I doubt that there's anybody who has been in the church for very long that has not encountered legalism. Legalism is it's, in my opinion, it's a form of spiritual disease. It has everything to do with how well are you keeping the standard, whatever that standard is. For the Pharisees, it had everything to do with the Mosaic law. 360 some people say 370 different commands that had to be obeyed. And that covered everything from how you worked your crops to how you treated slaves to where and how you, believe it or not, went to the bathroom. Everything about Jewish life was regulated by the Mosaic law. It was given, the Ten Commandments are I would say, the embodiment, the fundamental precepts and commands of God to his people given on Mount Sinai. You know the whole story, but that was many centuries before Jesus was on the scene. And the Pharisees had taken up what they believed was the most God-honoring posture, emotional, spiritual, intellectual, physical posture that was possible to honor God and his commands. Now, I've talked about this briefly before, but reminding you that the Pharisees were not it was somewhat fairly recent. It was within that they had been established. It was within what we have as 300 years of silence between Malachi and Matthew. It's called the intertestamental period. They had arisen as in response to what was happening in Israel. They were becoming secularized, and the initial motivation of the party of the Pharisees was legitimate. It was to call people back. These Israelites who were disregarding God's ways and will, his direct commands about how they were to conduct themselves as individuals and a group. I think that's a reasonable, positive, even godly motive. By the time Jesus had come, there had been at least 250 years of history already. And when you think about any group with 250 years of history, just think about our own political situation with Democrats and Republicans. Neither Democrats nor Republicans are the same today as they were in 1802. So it changes over time. one of the things that had happened with the Pharisees is that they had become so locked in on the law that they had lost sight of the lawgiver to a large degree. I have a theory about the Pharisees and those who today wouldn't want to be called Pharisees, don't believe they are Pharisees, but probably are more Pharisaical than any of them want to admit in the church today, is this. The Pharisees wanted to do things that would make God obligated to bless and give them the nod. Right? Their relationship to God was based on their level of obedience to Him. There can be a good, righteous motive there, but the problem is it doesn't work with God's design. From the days of Jesus onward, it has not been about law keeping. It has been about love. Jesus said it this way when he was asked, okay, what's the greatest command of all? You remember what Jesus said. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Where's obedience in that formula? Well, it would only be as an outcome of love. You can carry this too far, but you've got to carry it a little ways to embrace, to apprehend the strength and the weight of what Jesus said. The point of the law is to love God. Love Him. When people love God, they have a unique and very powerful motivation to live their lives according to His design. Okay, the Pharisees were less in love with God, in my opinion, than they were in love with the law. And that creates problems. Now today, legalism in the church is no less, in my opinion, a problem than it was in the first century. And in some ways, it's even maybe more problematic. Okay, here's what I see about legalism in the church today that I think was the same thing that the Pharisees had been gobbled up by from within. What was the point for the Pharisees of keeping the law? Well, it was to get God's approval. Now, from Jesus onward, certainly from the resurrection onward, I think from His death onward, we have a new insight into God's design. We don't get His favor, we don't get His love by behaving in a particular way. How do we come into this? What even when Moses spoke these words in Deuteronomy chapter 6 to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, how do you enter into that kind of a love relationship? Well, Paul wrote about it in Ephesians chapter 2:10, verse 10. I talk about this all the time. It is by grace you have been saved through faith. Okay. How I enter into this love relationship with God is by grace. through faith. In other words, you see, I think of this whole thing about how can I be saved? That's another way maybe for me to phrase that is, how do I enter this love relationship with God? By grace, through faith. I access and embrace what this love that God now has for me through my faith, by trusting Him. This is a huge, big deal. But see, here's what I see in legalists today, and I think it's true of the legalists in the first century. They don't want to need God's grace. Okay, your grace is wonderful, God, but I don't want to take any of it up. So that there's more available for those people who just can't quite get there. But I don't. I will live my life in such a way that I wouldn't need your grace. Wow. Does that, when you hear that, does that kind of smack of pride? Because I think pride is at the core and heart of legalism. I'm so good. I behave so well. And I don't just obey so well, I obey the law to the last jot and tittle, which is a Hebrew term for dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's. I don't need grace because I am that good. Ooh. No, you're not. I don't even need to observe you firsthand and your behaviors. I don't even need to know your thoughts to be able to tell you you're not that good. You're not. I'm not. And I have to guard myself continually that my pride doesn't get in the way of God's grace to work in my life. See, I even think there is a sense in which the ultimate limiting factor for me as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, in terms of the grace I experience, is my pride. When my pride is up, my experience of grace is down. And correspondingly, when my pride comes back and down, I experience God's grace to a greater degree. James said it this way, and so did Peter. God gives His grace to the humble, but He resists the proud. Peter says, because of that, humble yourself before the Lord, and in due time He will lift you up. That's how that works. But without humility, essentially the only response to God that we will be able to give is our performance. So is my performance not important anymore? I don't believe that, but I believe the motivation for my performance is the key. For me, when I am humble, that makes God's grace. It's not that more grace is available to me. If somebody were to pump more oxygen into this room, I don't think it would. Right now, it's not going to make any difference, noticeable. And I already have God's grace. God's grace has already been extended to me. That's maybe the way to say it. But my pride will keep me from experiencing it. When I am humble, that is how and when God's grace has its greatest effect in my life. And so, here's my challenge. Look into your own heart. Is there a Pharisee kind of living at your address? And if there is, humble yourself. Humble yourself. Well, okay. I went over time. See you next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.